Welcome to the Courage to Live podcast. My name is Josh Bitsko. I'm a retired police captain with 24 years of experience in Las Vegas. Currently, I travel the country and I teach people about courage, resilience, and leadership. Joined with my co-host Jenna and wife.
Hello.
So, in the podcast today, we're going to talk about the recent active shooter incident in Michigan at an LDS church. But before we get into all that, you want to talk about our week a little bit?
It's been a heck of a week. When my son Max was little, I don't remember what happened, but he just said to me, "Mom, it's been a heck of a week." So that is what we still say around here, and it really has been.
It really has been.
Josh taught at a conference here, a NeoGov Ignite conference, and, well, I guess keynote spoke, not really taught. And we had a booth for our business, Bitsko Consulting, and then his book released on last Wednesday, October 1st. And he had a book launch, and there's been a lot going on, but all good things.
And in the middle of all that, I drove to Prescott and taught a class there and then drove back. So you are correct, and Max was right. It has been a heck of a week.
Yes. All good things, though.
They are good things. It's good to be busy.
Yes.
It's better than not having any business coming in at all.
Yes.
So, and it was kind of cool. The book launch was cool because we did it at the Mandalay Bay, and having the opportunity to, on the anniversary, create a good memory there I know it was impactful for me, and that was your idea. So,
well, all good ideas come from me. So you're welcome.
Correct. Correct. That's called having a happy marriage. So on September 28th, there was an active shooter incident at an LDS church in Michigan. And before I get into all the details, mind you, it hasn't been that long since this happened. So the investigation is still happening. It's still ongoing. I can tell you from being on the other side of investigations like this, it does take a lot of time to really get down to the exact details of what happened.
And I just want to point out that the reason that we're talking about this is part of the goal of this podcast is, we want to cover a broad range of topics, but obviously Josh has been involved in multiple active shooter incidents. And so we think it's important to talk about these as they come up and kind of look at what happened and how we can best serve people by giving our thoughts on the subject matter. And Josh does happen to be a subject matter expert on active shooters. And I will say on that note too, just for people out there that are not necessarily involved in law enforcement or tied to it in any kind of way, that you have a lot of people, law enforcement, that will say that they are a subject matter expert in something. And Josh and I's opinion is that unless you have been actively involved in, say, an active shooter, it's hard to call yourself a subject matter expert. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there are people that dedicate their lives to studying incidents and maybe can talk about the nuts and bolts of active shooters that have happened around the country. But then it's hard to talk about the emotional side or what it feels like to be there, or, how to respond correctly when you haven't done it. So
what would you call people that study it and research it, but not necessarily have been involved? Is that still a subject matter expert, but in a different way?
I would say maybe, yeah, in a different way. Having, large amounts of knowledge of what happened, but not having the ability to really give firsthand experience. So there's the educational side of it.
The academic side of subject matter expert.
Correct. Yeah, that's a better word, is the academic side of it. And then there's the putting it into practice side of it, is so from my experiences, let's say I go out to a business and I consult on their, active shooter response plan. I have the ability to really understand how people are going to respond because I've seen it firsthand and been there.
So would you say maybe you have academic subject matter experts and tactical? Is that a good word for it?
Yeah, I would say, tactical or operational, because you have the ability to provide a little more depth to the plan. because, sometimes when you say, okay, well, then I need everybody to, stand up and walk out of the back in a single file line, and you don't take into account the intense emotions that people are going to feel, or my experience of seeing people evacuate and what that looks like, and all the obstacles that could come up when that happens.
Okay, so I would say then that Josh is he's a subject matter expert academically and operationally, and that is where you can differentiate yourself from other people out there that are speaking on active shooters.
Yeah,
there's not a lot of people that have responded and been involved in one.
Correct. I mean, well, if you really think about it, there's on average 35 true active shooter incidents, not mass shootings, which is, different. That's 3 or more people shot, but traditional active shooter where somebody is going through a public place, randomly killing people until they're stopped by police. And so about 35 a year, and you have 1 million law enforcement officers in the US, give or take. So yeah, there's not a lot of people with that firsthand experience. And then on top of that, because of my experiences, I really became a student in active shooters around the country for a couple of reasons. One, to give just a better understanding of my own experiences, but also have the ability to help people too. If I go out and teach or help places, develop their plans, it's nice to have both of those things and really have an understanding of what are the commonalities between active shooter incidents and then what's unique about each one.
Okay. Well, I did want to make that differentiation because I think there can be some misinformation out there from the academic side when, as is with most things, I think having operational experience or lived experience does come into play as well and add another depth to any kind of situation, not just active shooters. But I did want to make that differentiation because I think it's important.
No, I do too, is even when someone is teaching me something, I want to know that they've done it.
Yeah,
not just studied
absolutely.
It. So,
well, let's jump in. And I'm going to read a little snippet from this article about what happened in case there are people out there that did not hear about this. So let's see. Sorry, I lost it, of course. Okay. So the LDS church shooting in Grand Blanc Township, Michigan occurred on the morning of September 28th, 2025, resulting in 4 deaths and 8 injuries among congregants of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The perpetrator, 40-year-old Thomas Jacob Sanford, drove his pickup truck through the chapel wall, opened fire on the worshipers with an assault rifle, and then set the building on fire before being killed by police at the scene. That was from NBC News. And Sanford, a Marine veteran, attacked during a Sunday service attended by hundreds, including children. He used his truck to breach the church's front entrance, brought 3 improvised explosive devices, then began shooting indiscriminately. 2 victims died from gunshot wounds, and 2 others were found later in the burned remains. The building was engulfed in flames, likely started by Sanford using an accelerant.
So before we kind of get into a little more in depth, I always want to include talking about the victims, right? Is when you have these shock factor incidents, we talk about like the 1 October incident, and it's like the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. People really get wrapped up in the statistics of it. But on this shooting, one of the victims was a child and one was somebody who was 78 years old. You had a Navy veteran. And why it's so important to talk about these incidents and why it's so important to include the victims is so many people were affected by this one person's actions. And yes, there were 4 people killed, several more people injured or shot. Their families, their friends, everybody in that congregation, everybody in that community, honestly, everybody in the LDS community in the country and around the world were affected by this. So I think it's always important to talk about not just the details or the statistics, but really the impact of these incidents, because they do take a toll. Every time it's like a community loses a piece of itself, and the healing that comes afterwards is so important.
Well, absolutely. And especially the people in that congregation who were not shot or injured. They are going to live with that PTSD every time they go back to church, if they do, especially those children that were there. How do you, as a child, wrap your brain around something like that? So absolutely, is it important? And we see the ripple effects of that with the first responders and also the widow of this suspect that committed this crime. She will have the ripple effects, his children as well, because he had I don't know if he had multiple children. He has a disabled child. So she will have that impact as well.
Yeah. So I think that lends to the why. Why have you and I dedicated such a big part of our life to educating first responders on how to respond and how to respond quickly and with courage and make the right decisions, and community members with how to respond, and the whole education piece? There's a why there, and to prevent these, allow people that are involved to act with courage and be decisive, regardless of whether you're a first responder or not. I say all the time, bravery isn't reserved for people in uniform. So I'm sure on this incident, as more comes out, there will be stories of heroism from church congregants and people that are getting people to safety and getting people out. And so that really does lend to the why we're doing this, why we're talking about this, why we're here to just help people have a better understanding. Because if we don't, on top of, it's a honorable thing to do, the other side of that is then the experiences that I've been through really get lost and lose some meaning when I know that because I can be vulnerable and I can be open about my experiences, I know that it can help other people.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a targeted act of targeted violence, right? And again, I'm hesitant to get too much into motive because that part of the investigation is generally what takes the longest. But it has been reported that the subject had issues with the LDS community there. And so he chose that specific church for a reason. Now, I don't know the details of that because it hasn't been reported yet. But again, that's why it's so important to remember when you're in church, when you're at public gatherings, you always have to be aware of this. It doesn't mean live your life in fear of it, but I can tell you personally, when I go to church, I'm armed, and I do carry, just because of this incident. And I've had people say, "Oh, you're paranoid or you're this," but it's just the reality of the world that we live in.
Well, and I know specifically for the LDS church. So I grew up LDS. I am not LDS anymore, but I have friends and family members that still, belong to that church. And I was speaking to my mom about this just a few days ago, and she told me that she isn't sure if it's a policy in the church anymore, but it has been a policy for a long time that people were not allowed to be armed in the church. And I know that that's a policy for many other congregations or churches as well. So that again gets into a whole other issue of it may be time now for congregations and churches to start thinking about that a little bit differently.
Well, yeah, I mean, the reality of the world we live in is every public place, every business should have some sort of plan for something like this happening there.
Yeah.
And taking a real look at the policies and procedures that are put in place, whether it's a church, whether it's a business or a mall or a school, we really have to look at what procedures and training and policies you have in place and how that affects if this were to happen.
So let's get into what actually happened. So we talked about he drove his truck into the side of the church or the front of the church. LDS churches are really complicated. I still can't figure out where the front door is or which one. There's multiple doors. And so he drove his truck into the church, and it appeared that it was the church or the wall behind the pulpit. And so everybody in the congregation thought that it was a bomb going off. So they get up, start to evacuate. And then when they evacuate and run outside, he shoots them. Correct?
Yes. So he had a semi-automatic rifle, ones that are often used in these incidents. And I do think it's interesting that now we've had two in a row where the shooting started and occurred outside. You had the school, the Catholic school in Minneapolis and now in Michigan, where the suspect was on the outside exterior of a building. In one, he drew people out by crashing a vehicle into the church behind the pulpit, and then the other one shooting in through windows and from the exterior. And that is one of the things that I teach and when I talk about is, so we have suspects that take however long to plan, and they can do internet research on police tactics and, what past active shooter incidents, but we have to respond within seconds or minutes. So like we said, in this specific one, he had improvised explosive device. It's suspected he had an accelerant to start the church on fire. And then was heavily armed, drawing people outside of the building. And it's easy to look at these incidents, again, from a first responder perspective or just a citizen perspective of, okay, so he crashed a vehicle into the building. And so if that happens, this is what I'm going to do. But I want to remind people that there is always a level of chaos and uncertainty, especially at the onset of these types of incidents, right? So try and really visualize that you're sitting in this church and you hear a crash or an explosion. And the thought process that you're going to go through, did a drunk driver just run into the exterior of the church with a vehicle? Was it a bomb? And then what is the best response for me as a citizen? Okay, if a bomb goes off in a building, you think you're going to evacuate outside of the building.
That's your natural inclination, right? Is to get as far away as you can.
Well, especially if he's using an accelerant to set fire, then you're starting to see smoke, other signs of a fire inside. And then, so that's going to draw people out. And then you're in a very vulnerable position. It's like a bottleneck at a door, people exiting, people running. And it sounds like, again, it hasn't been reported specifically, but that was the plan, is to pull people out. That's what it looks like to me based on all of my experience on this. So, people exit, they're met with gunfire, and, you have multiple people shot. Initially, they had 2 deceased outside, and then after the suspect, and we'll talk about the police interaction with the suspect, after the suspect was taken out, the fire was put out, they found two more victims inside. Mm-hmm. And again, haven't released all the details on if they were shot or if it was, getting trapped inside with the fire. That's information that's going to have to be released as the investigation is ongoing. So the next part of this, and I'll say it, I got to be careful with how I word these things, because I'm not going to say it made me happy, because none of this makes me happy. But I was very proud of the first responders in this incident. Is you had first responders on scene within a minute of the first emergency call. And there are 2 things that matter on any active shooter for first responders. The only 2 priorities should ever be how fast you can neutralize the suspect and how fast you can get medical to victims. And every decision made, especially in the early portion of this, before we get into the investigative phase, every decision made should focus on those 2 priorities. And, you have to neutralize the suspect before you can get medical in, because you can't provide aid if you're going to become a victim yourself. And the biggest part of that is how fast officers arrive, how fast they respond, how fast they can engage the suspect and take them out. So what I can tell you is, just based on what I know, is our officers were well trained, right? They knew the priorities, they knew what they had to do. They acted with courage and got there very fast.
Because yes, that is absolutely the goal, but that's not always what happens, right? Sometimes there's a delayed response. Sometimes officers get there quickly, but they don't act quickly, right? And that is something that Josh teaches to law enforcement around the country, is that feeling of vapor lock or fear or anxiety, all different emotions, all come with different physiological effects. He teaches how to mitigate those in the moment, but that is, yes, you absolutely want a fast response, and that's the goal, but sometimes that's not always what happens, right?
Yeah, well, we have to teach our first responders not only what do I need to do, Most of them know the why, why we need to save lives, what I need to do as far as tactically, and we focus a lot on that. But sometimes we don't teach the how to do it. How do you overcome fear? How do you overcome the anxiety or that tactical paralysis, that feeling to freeze? And those are all very natural emotions that we have as humans, that we've, regardless of your belief system, whether we were created or evolved to have these emotions to survive. And when they happen, if you're not prepared for it, it can become overwhelming and it can cause that freeze. And I've seen it firsthand in some of my experiences, whether it's on 1 October or the UNLV active shooter. And then there's examples around the country, like of the Uvalde shooting, where you had a leader that froze and 376 officers did not make entry into a classroom in a school because you had a leader that was stopping that forward action. And we don't need to get into all of the why behind that and different things, but know that not only can we learn from training, but we can learn from failures. And so when we see those things happen, we have to talk about them. But so many agencies and just people are afraid to talk about those things because, it's embarrassing. It's hard to talk about. You don't want to upset people's feelings. But at the end of the day, if we're going to learn and not have those things happen again, we have to have the conversations.
Yes. And I wanted to point that out, that the officers on this call appeared to get their act quickly, which is exactly what you want to have happen every single time. I just wanted to point out that it doesn't always happen. And that's part of what we are trying to do and fix.
Well, yeah, because if you think about it, how many more victims could have died?
Right.
Or, even without getting first aid, getting help quickly, if those actions weren't decisive and quick, this could have been so much worse of an incident. You have I think it's over 100 people in the church at the time, and you have a suspect with a heavily armed. How many people could be killed? So that's why it is so imperative that our law enforcement officers that are responding are able to act with courage, be well trained, know what they need to do, and get there quickly and engage the suspect.
Well trained tactically and mentally.
Correct. Yeah. So, and that is often the missing piece. You can do all the tactical training in the world, but if you're not developing the correct mindset and having continual conversations about those things, then you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yep.
And so I have a quick on the timeline is the first 911 call came in at 10:25 a.m. and the suspect was neutralized at 10:33 a.m. And that was reported through CNN. Again, we're going off, a variety of different reports based on the research that you and I did on this to try and cobble together as much, because there is something about having timely information out too.
Yes.
So if something else like this happens, which something similar will happen, then it's important that we know what happened the last time, can learn from mistakes, can learn from successes, and, oftentimes emulate the behavior of what worked on other incidents. And we know what's going to work on this one.
Yes.
So suspects neutralized. What I haven't been able to get into as far as through research is, because the investigation is ongoing, is how quickly what their processes were for medical. Generally what you do is, so for medical to go forward, you have to have so every time there's a critical incident, there's what's called a hot zone, which means it's still active, it's still dangerous. You have a warm zone, which means, okay, we've neutralized the suspect in this specific incident. We haven't cleared everything out, but we're going to declare this a warm zone. And then you have cold zones, which means there's zero threat been confirmed. So, generally after an incident like this, suspects down, you clear out the immediate area, you call it a warm zone. And what the main training is right now through ICS, the incident command system, which is like the federal guidelines for responding to critical incidents, is you have a rescue task force, which is a team of officers to provide protection and medical personnel to move forward and start giving medical. Because again, so now they've neutralized the suspect. You have people that are down, that are injured, and there's timelines that come with different types of injuries. If you have an arterial bleed, you need to get help within 3 to 5 minutes or you're going to pass away. And so that's why that's so important to get people, forward and get people medical. So looking at this incident without having all those details, there were several other people injured or shot. So, This is an assumption, but I would assume that they got medical forward pretty quick too, because all of those injured people have, survived to this point. So you have the initial action, the chaos that goes with it, right? You have an explosion, and then people, you don't know what to do and how to respond. And then you have the shooting, and you have the police response, right? And then comes the investigation, which takes the investigation of these things can take months and months. I know that the federal government sent upwards of 100 agents to this incident to assist that community with the investigation. And that's just going to unfold over the next still couple weeks and months. And then, the next step, which often isn't talked about, is the community healing. And I can tell you in Las Vegas, it's still healing. I mean, we're 8 years out and we still have, news stories and, memorial service. They're still working on building a memorial and all of these things for the community to come together. And through that healing, we also have to take a real look again, like what we mentioned, the procedures of these public spaces and what the best practices are to prevent these from happening.
Well, and I want to make a note on the community healing part. So there were multiple GoFundMes set up for all the victims and the victims' families. There was also a GoFundMe set up for the widow of the suspect. And so I've seen a lot of conflicting opinions on that online, and people saying, well, it's not fair that the widow is getting, because they've raised, I think, almost $300,000 for the widow. It's not fair that she's getting more than the victims' families. But I was reading that the victims' families asked for the donations to go to her because they would be taken care of. So just so that people don't know, in case they're not aware, the LDS faith, they contribute tithing, 10% of their income every month. And so that tithing is used for many purposes, but part of that will be used for these victims' families to help them with meals, with funeral expenses, anything that they could need. And so these victims, I think that's truly commendable, no matter how you feel about the LDS community, religion in general. I think that is one of the most, if you're a Christian, Christ-like things that you could do, as deeply impacted as these victims' families were, to say, hey, make some donations to this widow because she's also going to have to deal with the impact of this. And so they knew that they would be taken care of by the church, that the church would really help provide a lot of what they need help with. Mm-hmm. And this widow would not have that same care. So I really, that impacted me very deeply, because that is something that they didn't need to do.
No, for sure. That's very honorable. And I mean, to take a real look at it, probably very difficult to do too.
Yeah.
And so, I'm proud. I say it all the time. I was proud to be, a Las Vegan, and I was proud of our community. I'm proud of that community too, because the real work also comes in after. And imagine going to church the next week. I mean, and I don't know, as far as construction and fixing the building, and, I'm sure they'll find a way, or a local school to fill in until they get a church built. But imagine going to church the next week, the next couple months, the next couple of years. I mean, that's the real human impact of these too. You have the loss of life and the tragedy and the shock and that chaos. When I talk about chaos, I don't just mean in the incident. I mean internally in the time afterwards too. It's just that you're just like overwhelmed and numb and all of these different emotions, and everybody handles these things a little different. There's commonalities, of course. And so just that's why these things have such a huge impact on the community. And the news cameras leave and the phone calls stop. And then you have to keep going, keep living.
You have to deal with it at that point, or not deal with it. And then that has its own repercussions, right?
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about what, in your opinion, can any church, school, I would keep it, let's start with churches. Mm-hmm. What can churches do to prepare for something like this? And then you can maybe get more broad with it.
Yeah, I think when you take a look at these incidents, whether it's a church or a school, there's got to be a lot of commonalities. The first thing is, when chaos strikes, what are people looking for? They're looking for direction, and generally that comes from leadership. So the leadership in a church, or even the leadership in a school, they need to be trained, especially on the mindset of, if something were to happen here, what's it going to look like? What's it going to feel like? And what do we need to do to respond?
And being prepared for multiple different scenarios, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. What somebody walking into the building and starting shooting at a congregation the response is going to be different than somebody crashing a vehicle into the outside, or maybe just throwing a pipe bomb inside, or, whatever it is. That's why the mindset is as important as the scenarios. So having somebody come in, look at all of their procedures, sit down with church leadership for that specific congregation and beyond, of, this is a reality. This is what these look like. This is what these feel like. And this is what you are also now asked to do. Is it fair? No. You're a bishop, they are in LDS churches, but any, priest or leader of a church, they are the ones that are going to have the most immediate impact on the congregation. And having the ability to say, okay, we're all going to go to the back of the church. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. So that's the mindset and the procedural training that should be taking place. And I hate to say it, but anywhere the public gathers, but specifically churches, because there are a lot of emotions directed towards churches. So they are seen as a soft target. And then it comes down to target hardening. So now you have, the leadership, because they can help direct large groups of people, but then the specific building itself, can doors lock? And what does that lock look like? Are the doors made out of glass that can easily be broken? Once they're locked, can people on the inside still exit? So, there's the structural things that you can do, and knowing that, a lot of times in these, whether there's an explosive or a fire, or like on the UNLV shooting, somebody just pulled a fire alarm. Well, that adds to the chaos, because what are you supposed to do when you hear a fire alarm? Line up and exit. So there could be a real possibility somebody pulls a fire alarm to get people out, just like this suspect did with the truck. And then there's the more, I'll say, aggressive but necessary steps, I feel, when you have a large group, or like a church like this, and that's hiring a security. And
we don't mean mall security, or right?
Yeah, not all security companies and security officers or guards are created equal. And so having somebody, again, that has that ability to have the correct mindset, like somebody former military or former law enforcement, that are not attending the church services, but are on the exterior, that are watching and seeing you. Imagine on this, and I'm not saying that there was any mistakes made on this, but if you had a security guard at the exit when this truck crashed in, that's valuable intelligence. That also, so on top of having somebody that's armed, that can act, that can engage a suspect and neutralize them, but the other side of this is they also know what's going on, so they can stop people from exiting because they see what's happening on the exterior.
Well, and from a crime prevention standpoint, it's also a deterrent. You're less likely to have a suspect come and commit a crime or an active shooter incident when they see somebody armed standing outside the building, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That lends into the incident prevention. It's easier to run downhill. A suspect, they want to choose what I said earlier, a soft target, and you're hardening the target, both structurally and now visibly. So not only do you want somebody that has the right mindset for it, but at the same point, you want somebody that is visible and they know is security and can see is armed. And again, that's the reality of the world that we live in today.
Well, and in speaking with my brother, who is also LDS, he said that their church building used to have different men of the congregation just walk around. They would do it in shifts and just, to make sure everything was okay. But I think my point of contention with that goes back to what you were saying, which is you need to have people that understand what to do if somebody were to come in and start shooting or be outside and start shooting. You need to have people that have been trained and prepared in that, because somebody that hasn't been and is just walking around making sure everything's okay isn't necessarily going to know what to do in that scenario.
Yeah, and I understand the idea as a church, you want to be warm and welcoming, and it can be difficult to say, oh, we need armed security outside. But again, that's the reality of where we live. Even in our lifetimes, we've seen, air travel change. Why is that? Because there's been incidents like 9/11 and the shoe bomb and all of those things that happened in airports. So now you have this whole process for security. Less things happen in airports, not just because they're stopping them in security, but people understand that they can't. And, I know the casino industry here in Vegas has completely changed since 1 October and their procedures and armed security. And, you go in one of these casinos now and you see the, response teams, which are mostly former military and law enforcement, which are outwardly visibly armed. And not only are they able to respond if they need to because of their experiences, but it's a visible deterrent. So as we're evolving as a society, these are some of the things that we can put into place. And, I've, in consulting with different businesses and companies, like, here's the reality of how you can make this safe. And this is what you can do to make that happen.
Well, and I think just coming from a place of me previously paying tithing, I would appreciate my tithes going to keeping me and my family safe while we worship,
Yeah, because you want to feel safe there.
Yeah.
Right? That's the one place that you don't want to be worried about those things. You want to be praying for people that have experienced the hardship. So, and I think that, that change in the perspective of how to keep these, these congregations safe, I think if you talk to the membership, they're probably going to be okay with it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I know this was like a overview of the incident. The investigation is still ongoing. I can tell you that both Jenna and I are constantly researching and following these incidents to glean what we can learn from them to help other people too. Well,
and with that being said, if you are part of a congregation and this kind of training would be of interest to you, please reach out to us. It's something we have talked a lot about, and we would be happy to talk to people about this kind of training. Well, not just for your congregation, but
for any place, anybody that's interested, but any place where public gathers. That's something that we do. And then on the mindset side of it, I do talk about that in my book, The Courage to Live, that released last week. And there'll be a link for that in the podcast description as well.
Yes.
So thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with a friend or subscribe, leave a review. And we both really appreciate you spending time with us today.